Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone. I am so excited to be here. I self-admittedly am a Christmas fanatic. And so just being able to be in our little faux kitchen here, playing with sugar and sprinkles and meltables and all things, teaching you guys fun things to do for the holidays is like the best way to start off not only Monday, but this week. So like Felicia said, my name is Megan Faulkner Brown, and I am the founder of the Sweet Tooth Fairy. And I'm coming to you today from just outside of Salt Lake City at American Crafts Studio. And it's been so fun to partner with them and with Michael's to bring you all, my fellow home bakers, my fellow hobbyists, just some really awesome items and products and sprinkles and inclusions and mixes and all sorts of things to just elevate your baking experience. So I hope you all had a chance to shop Michael's and see all the fun stuff that we've developed and have there for you. So today we are going to talk about some holiday barks. And as I was talking with one of my friends earlier, she wasn't quite familiar with what a bark was. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, it kind of doesn't sound particularly appetizing, right? I actually don't know the history of why barks are called barks. I did a little bit of research, and from what I could find, it's just the fact that what we're doing is playing with chocolate, or in this case, with some meltables, and the fact that there's really no like exact recipe, or when you lay out your meltables on the sheet pan, it kind of is a little bit rough looking, a little bit rustic. And you'll see when we break it apart, it kind of resembles, you know, wood, little shards of wood and whatnot. And so there are so many fun different things that you can do with bark. And I'm going to show you 3 different things today. If I don't run out of time, then I'll show you another one. But one thing that I like to say, and I apologize if you've seen my class before and you've heard me say this, but I like to say that it doesn't take a lot to take something that's ordinary and make it extraordinary. You just kind of have to think outside the box a little bit and just get, just tap into your creative self and yeah, and just think a little bit differently about maybe elevating a recipe that you've seen or something that you want to try by adding your own little touch to it. So that's what we're going to do today. The first, oh, I should say too, there might be like a little bit more downtime while we let some of the bark cool. So if you have any questions about anything, please feel free to ask them. And yeah, because we might just be having a little bit of back-to-back here while some of it sets up. So like I said, anything you have questions about, please let me know. All right, so the first one we're gonna do is peppermint bark. And I'm sure you've all tried it or bought it or made it. And I just wanna show you how simple and just, again, some other ideas that you can do to make it your own and just make it that much more delicious and that much more fun. So what I have here, this is actually just like a disposable, like casserole dish, but I've lined it with some parchment paper, and that's just going to ensure that when we take it out, that it's going to release easily and not get stuck to the pan. All right, next, so here are some of our dark chocolate meltables. And I've actually already opened some and put them in a bowl. I'm going to pop them back in the microwave for just a few seconds. And we're going to spread it into the pan. And the meltables are so wonderful. They're delicious. They're so easy to work with. And I like to say that I'd err on the side of melting them in the microwave. Like check them at about 30 seconds. On the back of the packaging, it says a minute or so, I believe, but I always would rather not overdo them than and under microwave them so you don't fry them. So I just put them in for about 30 seconds here. Again, I had already opened the package and just put them in a bowl, and you'll see it's just this really smooth, nice, delicious chocolate flavored meltable. And this is an entire bag, which is about 2 cups. And all I'm going to do is pour it out onto the parchment paper. Now, if you are like super chocolate fan and you want to make it a little bit thicker, you could do 2 bags, 2 bags of the chocolate meltables, which would be delicious and amazing. But I'm just going to do 1, and I'm just taking a spoon, spreading it out. Like so. You don't necessarily have to, go all the way to the edges, but this bag, which is again about 2 cups, should cover an entire 9x13 space. All right. So here we have our chocolate spread and melted all over the pan. And I'm just going to kind of tap the pan like this to kind of even it out and fill it in spots that maybe needed a little bit more. Okay, so traditionally, I would just, put this in the fridge, let it set up, and then come back with some of the white meltables and do that on top. But just for a little bit added interest and deliciousness, I just got these sandwich cookies, and I'm just going to break them up and scatter them on top of the melted chocolate so that when it sets up, these cookies will be captured inside the chocolate. And I just kind of press them down. Again, there's really no like exact science for what I'm doing in terms of recipe. I think I've probably crushed 8 or so of these sandwich cookies. And but maybe you don't like them and you don't want to do it at all, which is totally great. You can just skip this step and just set it in the microwave, or excuse me, not the microwave, the fridge, without the cookies on top. So I'm going to give this to Emily. There's a little bit of TV magic that's happening with this first one. I had done a batch previously, so she'll bring back the one that is set up, and then we'll go from there. So similarly, I had taken some of the white meltables, which are vanilla flavored, just a really creamy, delicious vanilla flavor, and put those in a microwave safe bowl and melted them. And so when she brings back the TV magic sheet of the chocolate and the sandwich cookies, then I'm going to go ahead and pour these on top, and then we'll let those set up. But at this point, does anyone have any questions or comments? Or does anyone share in their Christmas cheer and excitement as much as me? Because I'm so excited. Yes.
There is one question that just popped up, and she was wondering, what do you mean by the word set up?
Okay, great question. So these meltables come, here I'll show you these. These are vanilla flavored, but they're orange. So they come in these little wafers. Can you see how they're kind of like a giant chocolate chip? Okay, so they're solid and they have like a snap to them. You can just break them, and they have this, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful snap to them. And you can see again, they're set up, meaning they're not liquid. So what happens is when you put them in the microwave, they melt and they become more liquidy. They're not a liquid, but they're liquidy, they're runny. They, you can spread them. And then when you let them set out at room temperature, depending upon, you know, how cool your room is, or you put them in the fridge, they're going to set up and be hard again, just like this. So with this class in particular, because we're trying to move through a few of the different recipes, I had pre-made this one and allowed it to set up, because once it's melted and you put it in the fridge, ideally, I personally would want it to set up in the fridge and get hard again for at least like 10 to 15 minutes, just to make sure that as you kind of go through these recipes that it's completely solid, and again, that it's like set up to touch. So hopefully that answers your question. That was a great question. So thank you for asking it, and I hope it answered it. All right, so I'm going to show you. This is a giant piece of meltable that has these cookies on it. So you see how they're not falling off. I can pick it up, I can handle it, and it's one complete piece. So now I'm going to come back with these white vanilla meltables, excuse me, and I'm going to pour them over the top of this that's already set up. And remember how this is called bark, right? So it's not like this is going to have some like completely smooth finish. It's going to be a little bit rugged, a little bit kind of messy looking, which is fine. And I kind of just spread this around. And then I'm going to take some peppermint and spread it around, sprinkle it on the top, so you get that yummy peppermint flavor. One other thing you can do that I am going to show you later is Michael's has some candy flavoring, some oil-based candy flavoring that you can buy. And you can add flavors to meltables. You just want to make sure that they are oil-based flavors, because it won't affect the meltables. If you do ones that are alcohol-based, it will kind of make the meltables a little funky, and you don't want that. So again, you just want to make sure that you use oil-based. Michael's has some Loran oil products, which are awesome, that I've used for years. So if you wanted, you could put, you know, if you wanted this to be extra pepperminty, you could put peppermint oil into the white meltables. But then you just come back with the crushed peppermint, which is available at Michael's as well, and sprinkle it on top. And I picked up some cute little candy canes.
And Megan, I got a question for you. Even though since you're on the topic of peppermints, we have a couple of questions asking, did you actually crush the peppermints? And if so, how did you do it?
Okay, so these peppermints, so we have in the holiday section, we came out with some crushed peppermint that hopefully is still available at your local Michael's. So you can buy it crushed, or you can buy some, you know, candy canes like this, and you can just put them in like a Ziploc bag and take a rolling pin. And I wish I might have a Ziploc. I could kind of maybe show you. Oh, maybe not. But if you just put a bunch of peppermint candies into a Ziploc bag, take a rolling pin, and you just kind of roll till your heart's content, excuse me, until the pieces are whatever like size you prefer them. These are pretty crushed. Some of it's like a little bit of a dust even. But I'm a texture girl, so I like the dust, I like the chunks, I like it all. So But if you're crushing your own, you can do it that way. You can actually even put them in the food processor. It does kind of make the food processor a little bit sticky after the fact, but if you don't want to like roll for a while, then that's an option. It's a fun activity for kids because they think it's really fun to bang things and roll things to try to crush the candy. So, so hopefully there's something there that will work for you.
I'll give you my tip. My tip is if I don't use a rolling pin, I will use a mallet or a hammer inside and put within a bag just in case someone doesn't have it. Those are an option. Anything that's heavy enough to smash something is always a great option.
That's so true. And even like my kids, sometimes they'll like fling it, like if they think that's fun too. But like absolutely, Felicia, a hammer or a mallet is fun because it's like they get to destroy something and they have permission to do it. So what is better than that as a kid than having permission to destroy something? Okay, so here we have like so far, here's our first bark recipe. And I hope you could see that it was simple enough. It's just kind of having the right components to make it. So there's nothing super like technical that you're doing. There's not a lot of like fancy steps, but again, it's just thinking outside the box a little bit and throwing all these things together. So I'm gonna have Emily, do you mind putting them in the fridge, please? So put that in the fridge. We're gonna let it set up again because we had just put that the white meltables on the top. So under these lights and at this room temperature, they won't set up for a while if we just left them out here. So she's gonna put them in the fridge. And then in a few minutes after we do this next recipe, I'll have her bring it back and then I'll show you how you can break it up. Okay. Questions though, at this point before I switch recipes? We're good? Okay. So the next one we're gonna do is an orange cranberry bark. And when I was in my teenage years, a few years ago, I worked at a bakery and I remember thinking, I was like terrified of orange cranberry because it like sounded healthy and I didn't think, cranberries seemed like they weren't super yummy to me. And so I put off trying an orange cranberry scone forever. And once I tried it, I was like turned for life. Orange cranberry is like one of my most favorite combinations ever of all time. I feel like during the holidays, it's way more seasonally appropriate, but I enjoy it not only during the holiday seasons, but if you've never tried orange and cranberry together, I would advise you to give it a go because there's just something about it that is divine. I think it's so good. Okay, so this one we're gonna do a little bit differently. Excuse me while I do some dishes here while I'm talking to you. So with the peppermint, I'm gonna add some more meltables here. With that last recipe we did, you saw how I just poured the meltables straight onto the sheet pan and spread it out. Well, with this one, I'm gonna melt some of the meltables and I'm actually gonna put some stuff inside of it and stir it so it's like all incorporated together. And then I'm gonna spread it out. So again, not like this super hard technique, but just a little bit different than how we did it before. What I have gathered thus far are some fresh oranges because we're gonna put some zest into the meltables. And then I have some dried cranberries right here. And then here, this is actually some granola mixed with some trail mix. And the trail mix has almonds and some like dried apricots and some pepitas and just walnuts, just kind of, you know, like a little nutty mixture. And we're gonna use that as a garnish. And then I also, like how I was explaining earlier about adding some peppermint oil to that previous recipe, I'm going to show you how to add some orange oil to some meltables, and we're going to use that as a garnish as well for the meltables. So I'm going to pop this back in, back in the fridge. Give it another 30 seconds or so. While I'm doing so, let's zest an orange. Sounds like a fun idea. I just brought my zester, and I'm just gonna get hopefully about a tablespoon or so. Again, with these barks, I promise there's not like an actual recipe, meaning, you know, take 1 cup of this and have this much of that. It's just, I kind of just like eyeball it. I kind of taste along the way, which is a fun part of this gig. You kind of just improvise. Some of this stuff I just got from my pantry this morning before I came to the studio. And, you know, you can look in your pantry. I'll show you this, the next one we're going to do is like a gingerbread house kind of themed bark, and some of it's leftover Halloween candy, right? So you can kind of pull from what you already have, and again, just kind of get creative.
Hey, Megan,
Okay.
there's a question wanting to know, could orange extract be used instead of oil?
So so normally extracts they're not oil based. And the oil is way more like concentrated, and any of the water or the alcohol in an extract is going to affect the meltables in a way that the oil won't. So I don't know if you've ever worked with like meltables or candy wafers before, and it's like seized up, or you put water in it, maybe thinking like, oh, if I add a little bit of water, which is a totally normal mistake that we've all made. But then it like makes the chocolate hard, and sometimes you can't come back from that. So you're for sure going to want to use an oil-based flavoring, not an extract. They're common. Again, Michael's carries this brand, Loran, and they're super reasonably priced. This will last you a long time because we're only going to use like a couple tiny drops of it. And because it's not an extract, it's super, super concentrated. So I would for sure recommend doing the oil-based. Okay, I hope that answered your question. Okay, so here's our white meltables. I'm going to add in some cranberries. I'm going to add in some orange zest. And I'm going to add in a little bit more of the cranberries. Probably a lot of it more, actually. And we're gonna, ooh, that bowl is hot. Okay, so you can even see, even like some of the pulp from the oranges has water in it, right? So you can see the texture of the meltables is a little bit different. It's not as smooth. Obviously, like the pulp, the rind itself, the zest, I should say, is textured, but water is going to affect the meltables in a way that if you're doing something like this is not a problem at all. But if you're using it in another way, you might be a little bit frustrated with how it turns out. Oh, and I should say, when I melted this, it was not a full bag. It was only about a cup of it. Because I'm using a smaller bowl and I knew I was going to be adding stuff to it, I didn't use the full bag because I knew I was going to need the space to fold in the stuff. But at home, I'm sure you have bigger bowls. Okay. So here is the white meltables with some orange zest. And then I'm going to put some of this granola kind of nut mixture on top. Like so. And then kind of just press it down, similarly to how we did with the sandwich cookies on the peppermint one. Missed a spot right there. Okay. Yum. I mean, it feels healthy, right? Okay. So I'm going to ask Emily to, will you please bring back the peppermint one after then take this one to the fridge, please. And then we will break up some of this peppermint one. Clean my station a little bit. All right. Does anyone have any questions? No?
We do.
All right.
We have a couple of questions here. There's a question asking if the oil is the same as the oil used in a diffuser, and I kind of want to say no, because that goes into a diffuser is not edible.
So I'm not an expert in diffusers, but if it's like an essential oil, then I think you're good. Like I've personally never used that, but I know that like essential oils are edible, right? So maybe just check, you know, where you got it from and see if they say it's okay to consume. But my gut would say that it would be okay. But I don't want to lead you astray, and nor do I want to lead you to like the hospital or something. So real quick, I'm gonna show you adding this oil. This is orange oil. Again, this is Loran orange oil from Michael's. I'm just gonna show you adding some and putting it in this piping bag, because when we get the recipe back from the fridge, the orange cranberry one that we just did, we're gonna garnish it with some orange flavored meltables. Thank you for staying with me. Because like I said, I know there's like a lot of back and forth between the studio and the fridge, but hopefully you're following along, and hopefully it's making sense, and hopefully it feels easy enough for you to try.
There's another question out there asking, why did you choose not to mix in the granola nut mix?
Oh, there's actually no reason. You totally could have put it in with the orange zest for sure. I just visually was thinking that it might look cuter to have some on top, because we're going to come back with some orange meltables and like drizzle it on the top. But I think that that's a great idea to mix it in. And I would suggest that you try it for sure. Because honestly, you could just, even like with the peppermint one, you could just get a bowl and mix the cookies, mix the peppermint. Like you can just mix all these inclusions into it. The only thing you'll want to steer clear of is anything that's like, anything that can melt itself. So you probably wouldn't want to like fold in chocolate chips while into your meltables, right? Because they will melt themselves. But all this other candy or nuts or granola or whatever will be just fine. Okay, so if you have oil, candy making oils, you know that they're very, very concentrated. So like if you're making a buttercream or you're flavoring a cake, right, you might do like a tablespoon of vanilla or almond or whatever. With oil, you don't want to do that because it's so concentrated that it will like overpower, things pretty easily. So here's this little cap to the oil. And I just kind of use this as my guide. And I'm gonna just fill it like barely to, let's see if you can get this. It'll just probably be a couple drops so that can you see that? I don't know what the angle you'll be able to tell, but it's very little. And I'm just dropping it into the melted vanilla meltables that are orange, and you just stir it in. And again, you can kind of just give it a little bit of a taste to see if it's as strong as you like it. My guess would be that just even using that little bit, you'll taste it and you'll be, yep, tastes orangey. You'll be happy with the flavor. Again, I would err on starting off with a little bit, and then if you think it needs a little bit more, do that. You can always add more flavoring, right? It's a little harder to take it away. But if you do, let's say you do accidentally put in like way too much flavoring, you can add additional meltables to it to kind of dilute the flavor. So you'll be using up some meltables, but you'll be saving the, the overpowering flavor of the meltables. So, so now all I'm going to do is put this into a disposable pastry bag. And so now this little bag tastes like orange and it's delicious. So when we bring back the orange cranberry sheet pan that has our little delicious yumminess on there, we're going to drizzle this over the top of it. So it just has a little, it hits you with a little bit more of an orange flavor other than just getting like a piece of the rind in the meltable. So, okay. Here we are back to our peppermint. So I'll show you this again. It's completely set up. You might get some chunks that maybe fall off, or there might be some powder that falls off. That's totally fine. But again, it's completely set up. It's one piece, and this is how you want your bark before you break it apart. And this is really easy. You just start breaking it into pieces. And again, some things might fall off, which is fine, because we do this for neighbor gifts sometimes, and you just put it in like a little cello bag, or you can put it in a mason jar, or you can find a cute little holiday gift box at Michael's and put it in there. And it's just delicious and fun. So I don't know about you, but I think that looks really yummy to eat. There's like a giant chunk of sandwich cookie right there. So fun. The other thing that you can use bark for is for like cake decorating, right? So you could make a chocolate cake, make this bark, and then use it along the sides of the cake or on top of the cake as your, not only your decoration, but just to add some flavoring to it. So, yum, right?
Hey, Megan,
Yeah.
if you wanted to make it thicker, how many layers would you say you can put on top of that?
So, oh my word, honestly, you could do however thick you want it. So the Meltables bags comes with about 2 cups of Meltables, which again will fit a 9 by 9 by 13. But if you want it, if you want it extra thick, which I think would be so yummy, then you can double, triple, whatever you feel like. One thing just to note is that if you are making it thicker, then it will need to set up longer in your fridge because there's so much of the chocolate that needs to cool. So it will take a little bit longer, but yeah, you'll just want to be mindful of that. And then I would recommend, the great thing about bark is that it's hard to mess up. It's easy to make, and you can do it ahead of time. So you can seal it and store it in an airtight bag or container in your fridge or freezer even. And so that will even ensure even more that it is completely set up. So where I was going was like, if you do it thicker, maybe it's something that you start in the evening and you just let sit up overnight in the fridge. You don't have to. It won't take hours for it to set up, but you'll just like rest assured knowing that it's all the way set up through and through. But yeah, I think a really thick one would be delicious. And I think when you do I call them inclusions, like when you do a sandwich cookie or the granola, or maybe it's like rice cereal or whatever, when it's thicker and you have some of those other components to kind of break up the chocolate, I think having it thick would be like so yummy, especially with those other things. So, okay, so cute, right? And yummy and easy. And
Another question for you.
Yeah.
So other than, I guess, peppermint, I think some are asking, would you be able to use like a caramel or a toffee?
To flavor it or to fold into it?
I think to fold into it. Yeah,
so the toffee, absolutely. You'll just want to be mindful that I would probably, melt your meltables. And then with the toffee, I know like every recipe is different, or if you buy it, all places make it differently, right? But toffee can melt itself, right? Because it's essentially hard candy. Ish. But so what I was getting at is just if you melt your meltables, you can kind of let them set at room temperature for a few minutes, just so it's not so hot, because I don't know which kind of toffee you're going to use, but you don't want to put it in and then have the toffee melt inside of the meltables. Although now that I'm saying that out loud, it might actually be really, really good. But for sure, toffee. Caramel. So this is something that I have personally never tried to put like a soft caramel in. Caramel sauce, I don't think would work. I think it would affect the chocolate itself. I think like a soft, chewy caramel could totally work. And I feel like you just challenged me to try something and I want to try it now. But that would be so good. I think timing when you put it into the meltable would be kind of the tricky part, because again, you want it to be the caramel itself to be set up enough that it doesn't totally melt, and you want the meltable to be cool enough that it doesn't melt the soft caramel, if that makes sense. But Felicia, let's follow up with each other, because that sounds like a really fun thing, and I would love to let you know how it turns out.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be so fun to try. Or if you try it, tag Michaels, tag Sweet Tooth Fairy, let us know, because that sounds like such a fun thing to try. So thank you for that question. Okay, we're gonna hustle through. But here's our orange flavored meltables in a pastry bag. All I'm doing is gonna squeeze, go over the top. Let's do this way too, why not? extra orangey. Oops. Okay, Emily here. Do you mind please putting this in the fridge? And we're going to power through our gingerbread house one. And it's going to be fine, guys. It's going to be great. We're a little tight on time, but that's all right. Okay, this one. So, meltables. I sound like a broken record, but they're so delicious. They're so easy to use, and there are lots of options for you to try that you can get at Michael's. So one flavor that we have this holiday season that is just divine, if you are a gingerbread fan, is gingerbread. So I'm gonna melt, or rather, I have melted some gingerbread meltables. And this recipe, I just am calling it like gingerbread house art because we're going to use a bunch of fun candy and just things that maybe you would use for a gingerbread house. Throw it on there and it's going to be so fun and so yummy. Now, one thing, another idea, do you happen to know if we have a gingerbread cookie cutter anywhere close? If not, that's fine. I can talk them through this. Would you want to grab one? Because I want to show them how you can do shaped, you can cut out the meltables into shapes. So if you're like me and you have a freakish amount of gingerbread cookie cutters, I don't expect you to, like I do, but if you do, you could line up the gingerbread cookie cutters and then essentially pipe the melted gingerbread into the cookie cutter. I'll show you here when Emily gets back how that would work. Because what's going to happen is the meltables will then set up inside the shape of the gingerbread man or woman. So which is so fun and so cute, and they make the most darling presents. So that's an idea. You obviously can do any shape. The more intricate the cutter, the kind of higher the risk is of it not like having that much detail. You know, if you have a cutter that has like a lot of really acute angles or whatever. But the gingerbread man cutter is simple enough that it should work. So you can either cute. Oh, this is Sweet Sugar Ball. She's my fave, and these are available at Michael's as well. Cutest. It's also a reindeer and a gingerbread man, so cute. Okay, but pretend I had several of these or whatever. You can just either do this, line them up, or you can do it the other way I described, where you line them up first, then you fill. But this will work too because it's all we've got, but also you'll have some bark that's a little bit like abstract, like we just did with the Oreo one. That will be super cute and fun. So, okay, I'm gonna melt, oh, we've got some red and green as well. Throw these in for a little bit longer. Oops. But you can see here, I've got pretzel sticks, I've got gumdrops, I've got sprinkles, I've got more sprinkles, which is just so fun. Got some M&Ms, some candy canes. Actually, I'm gonna hold off on the candy canes. Excuse me, because I'm just remembering this is gingerbread flavored. So if you like your gingerbread and peppermint together, by all means, feel free to do it. But I'm gonna hold off and just do some things that I think pair better with the gingerbread meltables. So I'm just breaking some more sticks of pretzel sticks. I've got these that we'll come back with. Again, there's no rhyme or reason to recipe wise to how to do this. We're just kind of, we're feeling it. We're in the zone. And I see a burnt pretzel, which might be my love language. I love burnt everything. Chips, toast, all of it. It's my favorite. Okay. So another thing you can do is you can score your meltables. So I'm just going to cut some lines, and you'll see here when we break it apart that you can get straighter lines should you be looking for that. Again, these are fun to do as cake decorations, cupcake decorations, whatever you desire. So this is just some green meltables. These are not flavored. These just are vanilla. I didn't put any flavoring in here. Do some inside there. If you, excuse me, if you don't have pastry bags, that's fine. You can still drizzle with a spoon. It's a little less uniform because as the meltables dip out of the spoon, it's a little thicker in some spots, but so fun. Do a little more sprinkles because I can. All right. Do you mind? Thank you. Okay, I think, do you mind bringing back the orange cranberry one? Okay, awesome. So we have a few more minutes. Emily's going to bring back our orange cranberry one. We'll break that one apart, and then right towards the end, I'll show you how the little gingerbread man turns out and how the scored ones turn out as well. But I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's given you some ideas. These
And
make
Megan?
really, oh yeah, yes.
While we're waiting, there's a question asked from one of our viewers that she was told that to never put chocolate in the refrigerator and wanted to know, how does the meltable chocolate vary from normal chocolate?
Okay, so, oh, thank you. That's a great question. So the meltables have oil in them. So they're technically not like a pure chocolate. So, which works out really great for me and those of us who aren't like certified chocolatiers, because as you might be aware, like to temper the chocolate, there's a lot of science that happens with the crystals and the cocoa butter and all the things. So having the meltables, we formulated them such that you don't have to be an expert when it comes to using them. So they are fine in the fridge, and I've used them for a long time, and I personally haven't had any problems with them like setting up in the fridge or blooming in the fridge or anything like that. So just again, I think it's the way that we've like developed them to be a little bit more versatile for the non like professional chocolatiers, which I am 100% in that camp. So hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully it means that you guys are more successful when you're playing with them, because they're a little more forgivable and they're really easy to melt. And the other thing I should say is like, so here I have this whole bowl of the vanilla ones and it's melted, right? You can pour this onto a baking sheet. You can pour this into a disposable pastry bag or a Tupperware and just let it set up, and then you can reuse it. Like you can remelt it and use it for your next project. So they kind of have magical powers, and for which I am grateful because I love that it means that they go, you can use them longer and you can use them more. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay, so thank you for the question, by the way. So these, same thing with the peppermint bark, like just breaking them into pieces, and so fun. You could also do, because as I'm looking at this, I mean, it looks delicious. It looks a little harvesty, which is totally fine. But you could get like the cherry oil and do a red drizzle, so it just feels a little bit more holiday-y. But you know, you put this, I mean, you could take this as like a hostess gift. You could serve it on your dessert table, and so good, so good. Do you have our peppermint one that we've already done? I just want to have them. It's right behind me. Oh, okay. We'll just put these right here, and then together so you can get a little bit of a close up, and then we'll just give the gingerbread house one like one more minute. It probably won't be set up all the way, but just know that it would if we had more time. But I'm gonna try just to see if our little gingerbread guy is set up enough. If not, I can still kind of show you how to do it. And when you try it at home, just know that you'll just want to let it sit in the fridge for a few more minutes. But we have a time constraint because we're in studio and we're live. So we're just crossing our fingers and hoping that that fridge works some magic quickly. Oh, one thing I also wanted to note is that it's been so fun doing these classes, and it's been so fun to be here with you guys. So thank you for taking your time and spending it with me today. Please keep your eyes peeled because I have an upcoming class that's like geared towards kids, and we're going to be doing lots of fun things with gingerbread, all things gingerbread treats. And I have 6 kids of my own, and so I feel like I can relate to my younger friends because I spend a lot of time with my kids. So we speak the same language. So if you have some kiddos or grandkids or neighbors or friends that you think would have a fun time, please go to Michael's website and look under their classes and upcoming events, and you should be able to find more information about that class as well as others. I'm here a couple to few times a month for sure. So it's been so fun to be here. And
hey, Megan,
yeah.
I
Yes.
do have 2 quick questions.
Okay.
And it was one I almost forgot about. There was a question asked, if you were to make like the candy bark now, would it last all the way until Christmas? And then what is the actual shelf life on the meltables?
Okay, so first question, yes, you're just going to want to make sure that when you're storing them, you want to make sure that it's in an airtight container so it doesn't, so nothing in your fridge like spoils the flavor of your meltables. So I would put it in an airtight bag or like a container or whatever, and you can, yes, you can do it now and keep it in there and break it out for the holidays, for your neighbor gifts, for coworkers or whatever. But thank you. Okay, you're set up. Second question was the shelf life of the meltables. So I use them so frequently that off the top of my head, I don't have like the exact shelf life, but I would say at least 6 months to, yeah, at least 6 months. It's probably on the packaging, and I can get back to you on that. There are dates on the back that we have coded that show the expiration by the batches, So this one expires in March of 23. So we're at least, what, a year and a couple of months out from that. So they last. And I use them so frequently that I haven't had to hold on to them for that long, but I recognize this is my livelihood and my life. So if you do this kind of annually and once a year, then you should be able to hold on to them till the next holiday. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, real quick, 'cause I know we only have a couple minutes. So can you see, I'm gonna see if we can kind of get an angle to show a little bit of the score lines, maybe not, I don't know if you can see it, but there is just like a little bit of a divot from where I ran the knife through. Now, again, this didn't set up as long as I would have hoped that we could, but you can kind of just take your knife and follow that score line and break it off. It's not going to be like a perfect, perfect straight line, but straight enough that if you have strong feelings about having straight bark, that it would work, or if you're using it for a cake or whatever. Now, this little gingerbread guy, I'm just gonna, what I do is I just kind of push the meltables up around it, and they really just fall out of the cutter. The cutters have a little bit of give, whether they're these plastic ones or whether they're the chocolate one, or chocolate, hello. Steel, like metal ones, not chocolate cookie cutters. But look how cute is that? It's so fun. You could even do these without any of like the sprinkles and stuff on it and decorate it to look like a little gingerbread guy with eyes and, all the squiggles and whatnot. But these are so cute in a cello bag as a place setting or party favor or whatnot. But yeah, just lots of options. Again, just channel your inner creativity. Even if you don't feel like you're creative, I promise you are, you have it in you. And I didn't feel like I was particularly creative, really, truly, until recent years. But there's so many options that you'll have available at your house that you can find in your pantry, at Michael's. There's so many fun things that you can pick up. And I'm sure you have lots of holiday parties coming up or gatherings with friends and family, that they're quick, they're easy, they're kind of fail-proof. Yeah, I think that you'd have a lot of fun with them. So thank you so much. I'm so excited that it's the holiday season finally. And if you do make some of this bark, please tag us, let us know. We'd love to see. And I'm gonna follow up with you on that caramel somehow. Somehow we will get the message to you to let you know how that soft caramel turns out in bark. But other than that, have a beautiful rest of your day, and we will catch you next time.